We're going to start part two in the Michelle O'Connell's death. And we're going to begin with Crystal Socato's interview with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So on June the 6th, 2011, Crystal Socato gave an interview with Agent Rogers with the FDLE on a tape recorded session. She also gave an affidavit to the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office. And an affidavit to the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office, Crystal said that Michelle asked Jeremy for the keys when they was at the concert to leave, and she took them away because she thought Michelle was too drunk to drive. But in her interview with Agent Rogers, she gives a completely different story about why she took the keys away from Michelle. And she goes on to say that she took the keys away from Michelle because she knew if Michelle was leaving, Jeremy would leave and they couldn't go out after the concert. And she had to figure out a way to get the keys back and give them to Jeremy. And Crystal said she asked Michelle if she could look at the keys, which Michelle gave them to her, and she gave them back to Jeremy. This is Michelle trying to leave the concert, trying to get away. After the concert, Crystal said during the interview with Rogers that her and Andrew met up with Jeremy and Michelle at the surf station. And Crystal asked Michelle if she was going to pick up her daughter, which Michelle said yes, she wanted her mommy. How crucial is that statement for her to say, hey, yeah, that little girl wants her mommy? Crystal said Jeremy had sent a text to Andrew saying Michelle is acting crazy, can you stay? Crystal said that they arrived at Jeremy's house and at around 10:40, which is consistent about with that statement. And it's also consistent with Andrew saying that they left about 11 o'clock. So Jeremy told Crystal and Andrew that everything is fine because Michelle was leaving. And at that time, Michelle came outside and asked for her makeup bag. And after she got her makeup bag and her and Jeremy talked, that's when Jeremy went and told them that they could leave. So the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office, in their summary of Jeremy Banks' statement and action, gives details of Banks' interview with them. And Sheriff Shore states that during these interviews, Banks was asked to recount the events of the night of September 2nd. And through all these interviews, his versions of events about Michelle O'Connell's death remained largely consistent. Sheriff Shore goes on to say more convincing is the fact that Jeremy Banks' statements are supported by the physical evidence that was documented and collected from the scene. That is farther from the truth. Not every piece of evidence was collected and it wasn't documented. I'm going to prove to you beyond 100% reasonable doubt that we had evidence that was altered, tampered, moved, and destroyed to cover up a death. Several items were not collected from the scene or documented, which bears concerns about how this case was handled. Crucial pieces of evidence were not collected or documented, but left to be discarded as trash. These items were altered, moved, and tampered with. We do have pictures from Deputy Hawley's first 8 photographs and from the crime scene technicians that shows each piece of evidence in pristine condition. I can tell you when the time they moved it, time they altered it, where it was at before they moved it. Therefore, the physical evidence in this case was not collected and documented, so how can homicide ever be ruled out? It wasn't. The physical evidence was left to be destroyed by the detectives and crime scene technicians at that scene. Banks said in his interview, and all his interviews are consistent, that he never touched or moved anything in the master bedroom when Michelle was found, except for the phone and to hold her hand. I believe the most crucial pieces of evidence is lying just on the bed, just above Michelle's head. And we're going to get into a lot of that here shortly, but it's going to be a shirt. It has blood in it, the appearance of a bullet hole, outline of a gun, and gunshot residue. And the evidence was captured on photographs by Hawley and the crime scene technicians. In Banks' interview, he said Michelle made comments previously about committing, Jeremy, you just want to make me kill myself. Every case I've done, the other party has always made mention that that person wants to commit suicide. If Banks initially took those comments seriously, he would have acted upon and helped Michelle. In the same way, we're going to see later when he made a comment, don't do anything stupid. In the case summary completed by the Sheriff's Office indicate that Banks supposedly transferred blood from Michelle's hand to the underside of his shirt, which I found to be an absurd claim because, and we're going to tell you here in a minute, Dr. Hogan's autopsy report on Michelle O'Connell noted only 2 specks of blood on her right forefinger and hand, which were not smeared and could not have been transferred to Jeremy's shirt. It's 2 specks of blood. Given the position of Michelle's hand and the lack of blood on Banks's hands, it seems implausible that blood drops would have landed on the backside of her hand if Michelle killed herself with a gun and the gun being upside down and her hands wrapped around the gun as they say they did. And if she held it upside down and her hands wrapped around it, she would have had injuries to her hand from the slide coming back. And let me tell you something. If Michelle would have shot herself, there'd be blood just about everywhere. I'm going to tell you what that blood is a little later and how it's flowing and stuff. And if somebody shoots herself, there's telltale signs of back spatter, there's stippling on their hands, there's blood on their hands, arm. And when somebody shoots themselves out, listen, there's blood everywhere. So in Banks' first interview on April the 4th, 2011, Agent Rogers with the FDLE interviews him. He brings him voluntarily into Jacksonville, and he tells him he can leave at any time of the interview, and he's not detained. So he requests Banks' ID. He wants to make sure who he is. I kind of find this somewhat disturbing because he never asked anybody else to see an ID, and then Banks shows him his ID. Maybe this is for legal persons, but I didn't see that with anybody else that he had asked that to. Agent Rogers tells Banks he is a lead investigator and he's reviewing this case, and he swears Banks in. And then he goes on to tell Banks that this interview is about the death of Michelle O'Connell, and he wants for Banks to give his side of the story in what happened that night of Michelle's death. So Banks informs Agent Rogers that on that night of September 2nd, he and Michelle were not communicating much due to an argument, and he explains that he went to Scott O'Connell's house, which is Michelle's brother, that afternoon because Michelle didn't show up to ride the motorcycle as planned. But later in the day, Michelle called him and they met up at the house before heading to the concert over in St. Augustine. Banks mentioned that during the concert, Michelle seemed distant, often stepping out to smoke some cigarettes. And on the way home, they discussed breaking up, and Michelle planned to move out her belongings of the house and have her family come and collect them. So we know she's moving. We know she's going to go home and pack her stuff, and she's breaking up. Bank recalls that Michelle was driving recklessly like a horse's ass and asked her to slow down, becoming increasingly frustrated. Banks told Rogers that he had no recollection of what time they arrived home, but he said as soon as they pulled into the driveway is when Crystal and Andrew arrived. Banks explained that when he and Michelle entered the house, Michelle instructed him to tell both of them to leave because she didn't want to cause a scene. So Banks went outside and broke the news to them that, hey, him and Michelle were breaking up, and asked him to stick around for a while. During that time, both Andrew and Crystal said that Jeremy never entered the house until they had to leave because they seen him outside talking to them the whole time. Michelle later came outside to retrieve her makeup bag from the car. That's when Banks went to go check on Michelle. And then after he checked on Michelle, had a conversation, he went back and told them that they could leave, everything was fine, and that she was breaking up. So when he went back in, he seen Michelle pacing back and forth inside and started to talk to her. He expressed his desire not to break up, but Michelle insisted on needing her space. Banks said he asked Michelle for another kiss, but she declined. And Banks mentioned concerns about Michelle's daughter hating him, to what she responded, no, she's not going to hate you. She's going to hate me. Why would she even say that her daughter's going to hate her? That's the most absurd statement I ever heard in my life. Banks said at that time he went to go sit out in the garage on his motorcycle. We had heard the first gunshot. He rushed inside the house, found the bedroom door locked, called out Michelle's name, and heard a second gunshot. Banks grabbed a phone from the living room, kicked the door in, and discovered Michelle lying on the floor. He said he recalled encountering Michelle and holding her hand. He noticed a gun that was on the left side of her with a tactical light attached. Well, of course, it's his gun. He's going to know there's a tactical light attached to it. He also remembered Michelle lying motionlessly, her lips turning blue, and blood flowing from her mouth. That's very important because we're going to tell you all about that here shortly. Agent Rogers questioned Banks about moving Michelle or the gun before any deputies arrived at the scene, which Jeremy denied doing any of that. He further inquired if Banks had tampered with anything inside the house, to which Jeremy admitted touching nothing but the phone and kicking the door in. Banks clarified he did not relocate Michelle, only grasp her hand. He informed Rogers that how he demonstrated to Michelle how to hold a gun once before. He never mentioned her how to shoot it, and never mentioned to Michelle how to get that gun out of a 3-point retention holster. Agent Rogers approached Banks to inquire about who he believed had a clear mind on that night of Michelle's death. He goes on to say that Deputy Beaver, who remained composed and instructed Deputy Hawley to capture the photographs. Agent Rogers informed Banks that that Banks had requested Sergeant Faircloth to arrive at the scene. Well, Sergeant Faircloth should have never been arrived at that scene at night. Jeremy Banks should have been kept separate from everybody, but he was allowed to stand outside of a car and talk to people. So Agent Rogers wanted Banks to understand the direction of the investigation and make a decision based on the evidence, including the reconstruction of the scene by expert people and analysis of that crime scene. And it became apparent to Banks at this time he was now a potential suspect in Michelle O'Connell's death. Agent Rogers emphasized that he wanted Banks to make a decision based on the evidence that he was presenting to him. And in my opinion, Agent Rogers is treating Banks as a primary suspect in Michelle's death. He tells Banks that Michelle had taken clothes and toys to her car, and this is true by the crime scene photographs. You can see where she put them in the back of her car. And Banks said, well, she may have. What do you mean she may have? Michelle had made plans to take a CPR class on September 4th, and this is evidenced by the photographs of notes that was in Michelle's car. Michelle had planned on doing things. Agent Rogers proceeds to show Banks crime scene photos of the bedroom and location of the gun and the gun belt. And he tells Banks that the gun could not have landed in the position found. Banks' statement, she may have, would contradict any other statement from him. Banks never told anyone that Michelle placed clothes and toys inside her vehicle. Never. But then he goes, he may have. You see how all this is leading to a cover-up? Agent Rogers goes on to ask Banks if he agrees that the location of the gun could not have fallen in the position found by the forensic experts who tested all that theory and stated the gun was placed or staged. Agent Rogers goes on to say, do you agree with that? You know what Banks replies, uh-huh. Agent Rogers asks, do you see the logic in that? He responded, yes. He goes, do you agree with that, though? Banks, again, shakes his head, yes. Why would Banks answer yes to any of these questions? Did anybody pay attention to these interviews to the state attorney? Did Sheriff Shore? Apparently not. Agent Rogers continued the interview and explained to Banks that the investigation was leaning toward a homicide and all the evidence collected. Here we go. Homicide. Banks asked Rogers if he needed a lawyer. And Agent Rogers tells him, you will never see this information until some point in time. And he tells Banks that's a right and ethical thing to do is get a lawyer. And then Banks advises him he does not like the way this is turning out. And so Rogers stands up, goes around the table, and stalls. Banks is being told he is put on notice, and it's a shame that he does not get to look at the rest of the evidence. At this time, Agent Rogers grabs Banks' cell phone and tells Banks he has a court order for the cell phone, and tells Banks that they could download the phone and he could wait while the download is happening. And he also tells him he cannot leave because he has a search warrant for the address he currently resides at. Well, he told him earlier he could leave. It was a voluntary statement. In Banks' second interview, he gives with his attorney. He gives with Florida Department of Law Enforcement agent Rusty Rogers and with the state attorney's office, Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson from the state attorney's office begins the discussion by stating that he had been in communication with Jeremy Banks' attorney and that Agent Rogers was looking into the death of Michelle O'Connell. And he goes on to inform Banks that if you wish to speak with, you wanted to speak with us regarding the events of Michelle's death, and at the request of your attorney, you're welcome to start speaking and provide the explanation of what transpired on September 2nd, 2010. So Banks was instructed to start by reviewing what happened earlier in the day by his attorney. He claims he woke up to text messages from Michelle asking if they could spend some time alone after the concert, requesting him to put items in the washing machine from the washing machine to the dryer. Banks informs him that on that night of September 2nd, he and Michelle was going to take, or that day of September 2nd, they were going to take a leisure afternoon motorcycle ride before he dropped off at work, and then they would attend a concert. But according to Banks, they never had ridden a motorcycle before, and then Banks claims that after spending some time at Michelle's brother's house, Scott, he and Michelle met up at the house, and there was not much conversation between them. Banks said they drove to the concert, and while they were there, they had a couple beers, and when after the concert, they ended back home. Banks said while at the concert, Michelle told him that her daughter had bumped her head and she needed to go. So he gave Michelle the keys, which is confirmed by Crystal Staccato, at which time she had taken the keys from Michelle. And Banks told Michelle he would go with her. Michelle told him to stay because the concert was his birthday present. Banks said when he and Michelle arrived home, they went inside and friends, Andy and Crystal, arrived, and he went back outside and asked them to stay. Banks said at that time, when Michelle came out to get her makeup out of her bag, everything was fine. That's when he went and told them that they could leave. So, according to Stoccato's interview with Agent Rogers, she tells him that Jeremy was outside until Michelle came out and asked a question, "Have you seen the makeup bag?" To which Jeremy replied, "It's in the car." Banks said he was talking to Michelle. So after they had left, Banks said he was talking to Michelle in the kitchen and wanted to know if there was anything that he could do to make the breakup easier. This is the first time Banks said they were in the kitchen. Banks said he did not want Michelle's daughter to hate him. Banks said Michelle told him, "She's not going to hate you, she's going to hate me." I do not believe that. Banks said he went back out and then came back in, and Michelle was in the bedroom walking around, and he asked, "Who gets the dog?" Michelle told him, "You can get the dog because I got my kid." Banks told Michelle, "Do not do anything stupid." This is very important. Very important. We're going to find out here in just a minute why he said Michelle. He told Michelle that. Banks stated that Michelle did not do anything that night to make him think anything was wrong. So why would he say don't do anything stupid? So Mr. Johnson asked Banks the question, what did you mean when you told Michelle do not do anything stupid? This is the first time somebody's ever asked him that question. Banks answered he did not want Michelle to hurt herself. Everything's fine. She didn't seem out of the ordinary with nothing. She didn't say she was going to commit suicide that night. She didn't say she was going to kill herself that night. She was going home to pick up her daughter. They were breaking up. So Banks said that she made a statement like that before. Michelle did not make any statement like that before. I can guarantee she didn't make that statement. The report lists, the offense report by the St. Johns County listed location of that incident. And we know it was at Jeremy's house. We know that Andrew and Crystal, they didn't leave at 11:10 or 11:25. They probably left at 11 o'clock, just like Andrew said. Because Banks last saw Michelle at 11:10, which would have meant that they probably left the house at 11 o'clock. Deputy Grizzard mentioned in his report, Deputy Maynard and he took Deputy Banks outside the residence, and Banks said that they had a verbal disagreement and were considering breaking up. Yes, they were breaking up, but they had no verbal disagreement. They were fine. Banks went on to say Michelle had gone into the master bedroom and thought she was trying to calm down. What do you mean trying to calm down? You weren't arguing. You said everything was fine. So Deputy Grizzard said that all physical evidence was collected by the department's ETs and logged into evidence. That's a lie. That's a bold-faced lie. Because the bloody shirt on the bed of Michelle Collins' head with apparent bullet hole and gunshot residue and outline of a gun was never collected. And so you're going to wonder, well, how you know it's a shirt? How you know it's that? Well, I'm going to prove it to you. There was a black gun holster that was never collected as evidence, but secured in photos from the scene. The bullet fired into the floor was never collected or searched, but was later found by Banks and turned over to his sergeant. Are you kidding me? Deputy Hawley said in his supplemental report that he observed an open garage door and an open front door, and that he entered the front door and heard yelling. Deputy Hawley said when he entered the bedroom, he saw Banks on the floor with Michelle in his arms. That is false information. He wasn't in his arms. He would have had blood on him. More than 2 specks of blood, I can promise you. Michelle had only 2 spots of blood on her. So Michelle had blood running down the side of her face, into her hair, and upper shoulders. Let me tell you what this means. Michelle was laying supine, and I done told you she was laying flat on her back, looking straight up at the ceiling. She had blood that was running down her lips and her eyes, running down the side of her face and to the back of her hair, all on the carpet and onto some clothes on the floor. There wasn't no blood spatter. There wasn't no blood. There was a speck of blood on the finger. I'm going to tell you about that too. So the crime scene technicians reported that they were notified of the scene at 7 minutes after midnight. They arrived at scene at 5 minutes till 1. They collected a gunshot residue kit from Jeremy Banks at 0111 hours. They received his shirt at 0116 hours, the yellow t-shirt. They began photography of the scene at 0121 hours. They began evidence collection at 0245 hours. And we know they didn't collect all the evidence. And we're going to show you where they moved evidence. In part 4, we're going to show you photographs of the scene. They collected gunshot residue kit from Michelle O'Connell at 0255 hours, and they cleared the scene at 046 hours. The crime scene technician said a gunshot residue kit was taken from Jeremy and collected was his yellow shirt before entering the house. They also said the crime scene was photographed and sketched. 100%. This is critical because evidence was discovered that was not collected, preserved, but was moved and altered. And I'm going to keep beating on this horse until somebody gets it in their head. He had the entire team not been focused solely on suicide, the evidence was right in front of them and would have been collected and preserved. They took photographs of this evidence. Not one person mentioned the shirt, the black medical glove, or the black gun holster in their reported evidence. Yet one of them moved it, or several of them moved it, touched it, altered it, and destroyed it, covering up that scene. Let's get into the autopsy of Michelle O'Connell. On September 3rd, 2010, Kent Holloway, an investigator with the St. Johns County Medical Examiner's Office, was contacted by the detectives of the Sheriff's Office, Detective Tolbert. In Investigator Holloway's report, it's obvious he believes the victim died of a suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Everybody does. Suicide. It's implanted in everybody's head. Investigator Holloway gathers information from detectives not from the boyfriend or the family, but or the crime scene or the evidence. Investigator Holloway notes in his narrative that detectives believe that happened that night, which is a suicide. So he's taking the same thought and the same theory that the detectives made. He's supposed to do his own independent investigation of that scene, and they failed. Michelle O'Connell is believed to have committed suicide, and that's what was remained throughout this scene. This is also true in a medical report written by the St. Johns County rescue personnel, which states self-inflicted gunshot residue. How would they know? All the investigators who were at the scene that night left out crucial pieces of evidence. The medical examiner's report documented that Banks last saw Michelle 11:10, which is probably 100% true. This is very important. Should have raised red flags in the investigation. If Banks last saw Michelle alive at 11:10, then according to his testimony, both Garrison and Corrado left their residence, as stated, at 11 o'clock, and he went into the house several times to talk and try to get a kiss, and talk about their relationship. The bedroom door was never locked during these conversations and had not been locked at all. There was no need to lock them. Michelle was not upset, and they were not fighting. She wanted to break up. She wanted to leave. I'm sure she was trying to pack her stuff as soon as possible. Who was it the one that was trying to get a kiss? Who was it the one that was probably pressuring Michelle, do not break up? Who's the one that sounded like they're trying to get angry and they're trying to get mad? It's not Michelle. If Banks last saw Michelle at that time, that means, they had to leave, be resident before 10. Which in the St. Johns County Sheriff's case summary, after he talked to Michelle, he returned to the garage and heard a gunshot. Why is there an 8 to 10 minute window to call 911? That would put Banks and Michelle in the house together for about 20 minutes. The case history conducted by the medical examiner's office is vague, and to say the least, it does not give an account of the entire case of Michelle O'Connell. In the case history of the medical examiner, it states in attempting to reconstruct the events, the police theory is that the subject accidentally discharged a firearm as it was being moved from the holster. Here we go. They're taking the same theory from the sheriff's office, where they should be taking their own complete independent investigation, looking at the crime scene, looking at the evidence. Before that body was even moved, touched, or whatever, any items that surround her should not be moved. That's the office of the medical examiner. They should have looked at it. But if that shirt was altered and moved before they got there, shame on them. The reported autopsy of Michelle O'Connell's findings that she had an intraoral gunshot wound with a penetrating injury of the cervical spine, and it severed her spinal cord. Michelle O'Connell was shot through the front of the tongue and it exited through the back of the tongue. And I'm going to get into that, and it's probably, a little gross for some people. But she wasn't just shot inside the mouth. She was shot through the tip of her tongue, all the way through her tongue. It came out the back of her tongue. It went into her neck, and it severed her spine. And we're going to get into about that tongue. It's very important. So the cause of death is mechanical disruption of the cervical spine due to that intraoral gunshot wound. Manner of death is suicide. No way. No victimology was ever conducted on Michelle O'Connell, and homicide was never ruled out or investigated, so the theory of suicide was carried all the way up into the autopsy of Michelle O'Connell. So her alcohol level was 0.086. They did a drug screen. Remember them pills in her pocket? None of them were found in her pocket. She wasn't going to commit suicide. If she was going to commit suicide, she would have took them pills. And I'm going to tell you right now, she's not going to shoot herself by where her daughter sleeps in that room, on that bed. That ain't going to happen either. If Dr. Hoban had access to the shirt and all the forensic evidence at that scene tonight, this case probably would have been solved that night of her death and not seen the magnitude or the continuation to this day. The detective and crime scene technicians, we know, didn't collect all the preserve all the evidence, and we're going to prove it to you. This case is a massive cover-up, a mass proportion, and proof is coming. During the external examination, Dr. Hoban's noted that Michelle's hands were protected by paper bags because they took the gunshot residue. Dr. Hoban mentioned a slight discoloration on Michelle's right hand, which appears to be lividity. This is when the blood settles in the lower part of the body. And if a lot of you don't understand what lividity is, if a person dies and they're laying, whatever part of the body they're laying on, the blood settles and it turns like a bright red color. If Banks was holding Michelle O'Connell's right hand the night she died, and she only had one spot of a speck of blood on her fingers and one on the back of her hand, how would he get two spots of blood on his shirt, if it was only one spot? The blood would also be smeared. No blood was found on his left hand or fingers. No blood was found on his pants where he was kneeling next to her. We will never know because his pants were never submitted as evidence. Maybe this is why he was smelled of a shower, according to Deputy Maynard. One could summarize that Banks was standing in front of Michelle or leaning over her during the fatal shot to get the blood stains on his shirt. One could theorize that the shirt on the bed with the blood and and a possible bullet hole with the gunshot residue was placed over her mouth and head. Wow. We want to get into that too. We know that Michelle O'Connell would not have placed the shirt there or anywhere else except Jeremy Banks. There was nobody else in that scene. Only person that was there that could have put that shirt on that bed was Jeremy Banks. They don't want to answer that question. And nobody has been interviewed or interrogated of who moved that evidence from that scene and discarded it to cover up that crime. I have an affidavit I'm going to share with y'all later on too. Dr. Hoban's examination revealed that the bullet caused a laceration of the skin at the corners of Michelle's lips. Dr. Hoban reveals that the trajectory of the bullet created an in-suit defect in the anterior portion of the tongue. If Michelle would have shot herself in the mouth with that gun, there would be soot all in her mouth, not just the tip of her tongue. There's soot all in her mouth. There would be a lot more damage to her mouth than what there was. The bullet that created a re-entry defect in the mid-cervical spine into the deep pharynx. The third cervical vertebrae is shattered. The bone is broken into many small fragments. The cervical spinal cord is completely severed. That's of great importance. The bullet came to rest in the subcutaneous tissue of the mid-posterior neck. Very important. Dr. Hoban commented that the path of the bullet is anterior to posterior. He mentioned that the angle of the trajectory which is very much important in a suicide. No, it's not. And we're going to tell you why. Dr. Hoban did not mention the angle of the trajectory, which is very important. So data shows that the gun on suicides is often up at an upward angle. The trajectory of Michelle's injury is a downward trajectory through the tongue and into the spinal column. The only soot that I told you that was in Michelle O'Connell's mouth is at the tip of her tongue. Her whole mouth should be filled with that. All of this soot is located within that shirt on the bed. I'm going to show you later. And you're going to make your own theories. But I got experts that looked into this stuff. And it's going to blow your mind. Did anyone, including the detectives, the medical examiner's office, examine the position of Michelle O'Connell when the shot was fired? Did any of them consider that she was laying down when she was shot? If someone is trying to commit suicide in a hurry by firing a warning shot and then firing a shot in the mouth, will not take the time to make sure the gun is pointed in a downward and an upside down position. It is not going to happen. Data shows suicide by a weapon is usually at an upward angle. If this shirt was collected tonight of Michelle's death, maybe Dr. Hoban or Dr. Bulick would have looked for fibers inside of Michelle's mouth, matching the shirt. Well, they would have seen what the shirt was had. They would have seen the bullet hole in the shirt and everything. I'm telling y'all, we're going to prove it to you. The abrupt transition of the spinal cord results in instantaneous and complete paralysis of the entire musculoskeletal system of the body. It's called spinal shock. There's no gasping can occur under these circumstances. Sudden loss of all input to the body results in complete paralysis and shock. Even when the spinal cord is severed, death is not imminent. Breathing stops with unconsciousness, but the heart may continue to beat for several minutes. This is what we call pulseless electrical activity. That is when Michelle was, that's why Michelle's heart was still beating. Michelle could not move and she had no reactions after the injury, only a heartbeat. She was dead. So Dr. Hoban noted that documented injury to Michelle's upper right lid that was 1 centimeter in size, and it was dark and purple, and it was a laceration. He attributed that injury to the ejected shell casing. That's the most bogus crap I ever heard in my life. There's no way. If that was the case, the shell casing wouldn't have been found on the other side of the room to her left side. It would have been found right there near her. If Michelle held a gun and fired a shot that killed her in an upright position, then one of the shell casings could be in the position found. Both casings in the same location are a result of a firearm being fired in the same or nearby position. Come on, people. Who's investigating this crime scene? Dr. Bulick made a different recommendation that to justify the injury, saying Michelle held the gun upside down and the attack light caused the injury to the upper eyelid when the gun was fired. This is bullshit too. If she held the gun in the downward position, the gun's going to kick back. It ain't going to go forward. There's no way. If the gun was held upside down, as he stated and agreed to by Chef Shore, because that's the only way they can get to her injury to her eye. This is the most profound magical bullet ejection case I've ever seen. These cases would have to flip in midair and travel back to the left. This is the same magical bullet and shell casing that ended Kennedy assassination. The investigation by the medical examiner's office should have done a victimology the same way as the sheriff's office and the FDLE, which the sheriff's office did not do either, or the FDLE or state attorney's office. Did Michelle fit into a suicide category on the night of her death? This is critical in determining the motive and intent. Michelle had plans to pick up her child from her sister's house. If a victimology was done, everyone should have seen that Michelle had recently been promoted in her job. She was happy. She was leaving Jeremy, according to her family and her friends. She was getting that promotion. She was taking a CPR class. She was packing her things up. She was leaving. Jeremy admitted that Michelle told him to, hey, you keep the dog because she had her kid and she's going to be fine. The initial focus of the investigation should have been to contact neighbors and friends and families and co-workers. They should have canvassed that whole neighborhood. They didn't interview anybody. Why? It's suicide. So I met with Dr. Bulick after he took over from Dr. Hoban on several different occasions. And I met with him on June 6th to get his medical opinion on that shirt that was on the bed. So Dr. Bulick was shown the Holly crime scene photos. We know that was in pristine conditions, and both sets of the photos and the photos from the crime scene. And Dr. Bulick examined the photos, agreed that it was blood, and it could very well be clotted blood at that. And he could not be sure of a hole or the gunshot residue, but stated that this new evidence to him, and Banks should have to answer for the shirt and how the shirt got on the bed. Because he knows as a medical examiner that Michelle O'Connell could not have put that shirt on the bed. The only person that could have put that shirt on the bed was Jeremy Banks. Dr. Bulick said Michelle O'Connell had no other injuries that he knew of, and Banks had no injuries to his knowledge, which doesn't account for the blood that's in that shirt. Dr. Bulick confirmed that this was new evidence in the case, and if it could ever be proven that the shirt had a hole in it, he would change his ruling from suicide to homicide. And I hate to inform, because Dr. Bulick has passed away and Dr. Hoban has passed away, but we're going to prove here, beyond a reasonable doubt, that shirt has a bullet hole in it. And it was put on that bed by only one person. The sheriff's office never considered an outside agency to investigate the crime scene, even when a deputy sheriff's service weapon was involved in the shooting. They just did the investigation themselves. And what did they come up with? Suicide. Looking at the analysis of the investigation, the sheriff's office personnel are the ones who conducted the investigation. They're the ones who conducted the photographs, the crime scenes, and the analysis, the gunshot residue, and all that. This was way prior, before the Florida Department of Law Enforcement got involved, and before everybody was raising Cain that it was a homicide. The crime scene was not properly preserved. If the scene had been preserved, the clothing Jeremy Banks was wearing the night of the concert would have been collected and sent to a crime lab for analysis. All his clothes, the pink band that was worn by Michelle during the concert, would have been collected and tested for DNA and fingerprints. None of that. Only relevant evidence to the suicide was collected for analysis by the sheriff's office. No other evidence was considered because the crime scene was considered a suicide. The biggest piece of evidence that could have possibly be solved as some timely death were discarded and altered and moved. Someone needs to be held accountable for this. Sheriff Shore made the statement in his case summary in the background section on page 5. It is important to note that despite the involvement of the FDLE, the State Attorney's Office, and the 5th and 7th Judicial Circuits, the ultimate responsibility providing law enforcement services, including this case, rests with me as the elected sheriff of St. Johns County. In the final analysis, I am alone responsible and accountable for the conduct and outcome of this case. And indeed you are, Sheriff Shore. You are held to a higher standard, and you are responsible. You're responsible for the actions that them people took at that scene that night to alter, to move, and to cover up evidence related to Michelle O'Connell's death. So I ask you today, what are your core values of the sheriff's office? Apparently, they're negotiable. We can get into a lot of evidence and stuff that the sheriff's office did not do, and there's a bunch. I can go on and on and on to do that. Banks, during his first interview with Agent Rogers, agrees with Rogers that the scene was incorrect by saying, hey, the gun couldn't have been in that position. Banks' response to that interview, so Banks, if he agrees that the location of the gun could not fall in that position found, and forensic experts have stated that gun was staged or placed, goes on, hey, do you agree? We know what his answer was. Why didn't somebody ever look at that interview and consider what his statements were? All right, this is the end of part 2. We'll begin with part 3.